They are Jews. And they are Jews. And they were Jews.
Zachor, Atsimink.
Two friends, actors, Davile and Elias, travel around Lithuania in search of Litvak cultural heritage. From photos, surviving buildings, preserved history and people's stories, they try to recreate the life of the interwar Litvaks here in Lithuania.
Shalom Kadaini, the capital of cucumbers.
Not to taste a cucumber in Kadaini is just the same as to go to Palanga and not to see the sea.
Yes, the cucumbers are really delicious. Do you know who started the cucumber business in Kadaini?
Just don't say Jews.
Why are you saying that?
Well, we have traveled to various towns of Lithuania and we always said that Jews didn't have land and they were engaged in trade and crafts. So I just thought that they were not engaged in crop production.
Well, here's a very logical assumption, but to the surprise of many Lithuanians, it turns out that Jews knew how to work the land perfectly, and actually, even in a profitable and efficient way.
Well, like everything they did.
Yes, this was because they were mainly engaged in commercial gardening. They turned Kadaini into the capital of cucumbers.
It's really great news.
You see, Kadaini was overcrowded with craftsmen. They had to avoid poverty and hunger, so gardening was a very natural way out. In fact, most common commodity in Jewish shops were pickles and herring.
Yes, it's really beautiful that Kadaini has still maintained this tradition.
It is believed that cucumbers were brought to Lithuania in general by carriates, and they were cultivated not only in Trakai and Vilnius, but also along Nevėžis, in Pasvalys, Panevėžys, Krekenava, Naujamiestis and Kadainiai. It is believed that the traditions of cucumber cultivation passed from carriates to Jews, and at the end of the 19th century, the era of gardeners began when the railway was built in Kadainiai. Jews began to rent some land, hired Lithuanians, grew cucumbers, and at the beginning of 20th century, Kadainiai led the Baltic region according to the quantity of cucumbers growth. Well, the interwar period is interesting when not only cucumbers began to be grown, but also tomatoes, which was completely unprecedented in Lithuania, and many Lithuanians had not even seen or ever tasted tomatoes. It is an interesting fact that in 1920, after the restoration of Lithuania's independence, Gedani's police chief was frightened and wrote to the Minister of Interior, "We need help, there are no more policemen left in Kadaini. Where have they gone? They went to water cucumbers for the Jews because they are paid 3 times the salary." Well, it's actually created a business. Because of the railway built throughout Kadaini, trains could be used to export cucumbers. And in the interwar period of the important company of Golombek, Steinbach and Freeland was created. They exported Kadaini's tomatoes.
It was the Jews who were engaged in crop production after all.
Yes, they rented land and worked it.
Oh, it was rented.
Yes.
So I can say they had no land.
Yes, they did not have any land. They just rented it and hired Lithuanians who did jobs like planting and weeding.
So Lithuanians were the ones who did agriculture and the Jews were engaged in commerce, business, am I right?
Yes, they perhaps took up so-called marketing, not only in Kadaini but also in surrounding towns. Cucumbers were grown because people here felt that other regions did not grow cucumbers and that the profit was good. It was popular product, so from Kadaini it was transported both to Kaunas and Liepāja.
Oh, even to Liepāja? What an export!
Yes, because the railway was built through Kadaini, which transported the goods to Liepāja and from there to other even larger cities. By the way, in the interwar period, there were large fields around Kadaini, where only tomatoes and cucumbers were grown.
Jews grew cucumbers and hired Lithuanians to work in this entrepreneurship. They probably taught the people living there after the Holocaust the tradition of growing cucumbers did not end. It was successfully taken over by the people of Kadaini. Cucumbers were mass grown throughout the Soviet era, and greenhouses were built. Well, the Soviet government also tried to combat this phenomenon because it was an additional source of income. Prior to the beginning of the 90s, between 1982 and 1984, the Soviet government banned the construction of large greenhouses because cucumbers and tomatoes were grown and sold were appearing to be sources of income from non-collectivized labor. Well, residents of Kadaini would not be genuine residents without greenhouses, would they? Those big greenhouses that were built near the roads and could which be seen by the government were demolished and new greenhouses were built further away where they were less visible. So this business has persisted and now Kadaini is the capital of cucumbers.
We are in the old market square, which was like the first market square in Kadaini, formed in the 15th century.
It's more than 600 years ago.
Yes, and by its purpose, the name of the old market came to it. The first Jews of Kadaini started to develop here. Later, this place became a kind of Jewish quarter.
And how many Jews lived in Kadaini?
At the end of the 19th century, more than 60% of residents were Jews, so the majority of the population was Jewish. But in the interwar period, the proportion was smaller, at about a third Jewish among the 8,000 population.
Well, that's still a lot.
Jews started living in Kadaini at the beginning of the 17th century. This is quite early in comparison with other cities, knowing that Kadaini was in fact a private city of the Radvilas. In order to settle here, it was necessary to obtain their permission. The Dukes of Radvilas needed wealthy Jews because they paid higher taxes. Thus in 1624, K. Radvilas, the owner of Kadaini, concluded an agreement with 3 Jews of Vilnius, invited them to Kadaini and leased to them the customs of brokerage for the Nevėžis River.
You know, I have recently found out that the famous Gaon of Vilnius lived in Kadaini, a Jewish scientist. Due to him, Lithuanian Jews are respected around the world because they are descendants of the Gaon.
Yes, you are right. It is good that you have mentioned him. Eliyahu, the Gaon of Vilnius, had 2 teachers. One of them was his father. The other was a rabbi from Kadaini. He wrote about 70 works, of which 50 were only published after his death. Various legends and myths about him have survived, and both popular and scientific books have been written about him. From the end of the 19th century, fiction was also created about him. He was first depicted as the opponent of Hasidism.
I know that there is Gaon Street in Vilnius.
Yes, you are right.
And it was already in existence before the war. Then, of course, it was renamed and its name only resumed in 1989. There was a 3-story house with a courtyard where the Gaon Vilnius lived. A bust of the Gaon is now installed there.
It is really very impressive. I have seen it.
The Dukes of Radula tried to invite rich and influential Jews to Gedani because they depended on the taxes they paid it, and in the long run, such an influential community became central to the city, which began to become famous for the rabbis who came from a very famous rabbinical dynasty in Western Europe, the Catalan Bogans. So Elijah ben Shlomo Zalman was brought here and studied for some time. He later became famous all over the world as the Gaon of Vilnius. It is believed that he was only 7 or 8 years old at the time. He was brought to Kadaini and taught by a very famous Talmudic expert of that time, Moses Margoliot. Well, a local merchant famous among Jews was so impressed by this gifted child that he married his daughter Hannah to the Gaon at age 13. Thus, the modern descendants of the Gaon are the children of Hannah from Kadaini.
Aš gimusi labai dabar gražioj datoj, kovo 11, 31 metais.
I was born March 11, 1931. I'm nearly 90. I lived in this house, I married and raised my kids here.
Ištekėjau ir taip baigėsi tas gyvenimas.
In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and especially in Kadaini, the number of Jews gradually increased. It was not as if they arrived all at one time, but they were very numerous. Between 1700 and 1721, they were affected by the Great Northern War. There was a terrible disaster during this period. There was a huge plague. Lots of people died in many towns, and of course, a place does not remain empty for a long time. So the Jews began to move into empty towns little by little, and they filled many towns in Samogitia and of course Kadaini lands in Aukštaitija. That is Šieta, Krakės, Josvainiai, and Kadaini. In the middle of the 18th century, the number of Jews was growing. They took over the business of Scots who lived in Kadaini. In particular, their population increased in the 19th century when Lithuania was already becoming part of Tsarist Russia. Because Tsarist Russia had established the principle of resettlement limit, Jews could not live in Tsarist Russian provinces. So there were many concentrated Jewish communities in current Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Jewish population accounted for almost 14% of the total Lithuanian population. That's actually a lot. There were a lot of them in Kadaini too. According to the 1897 census, 3,733 of the 7,500 inhabitants in Kadaini were Jews. That's more than 60%. But there were Lithuanian towns where 80% or even 90% were Jews. Well, the First World War started in 1915. The retreating Tsarist army ordered the Jews to retreat together. Tsarist Russia proved they were unreliable and ordered a withdrawal. Of course, not everyone withdrew, but about 8% of Jews fled to Russia. After the restoration of Lithuanians' independence, they decreased significantly. Thus, before the First World War, in Kadaini, they made up 60%. And already after the restoration of independence, they made up only 1/3 of the city's population, and there were about 2,500 Jews.
My friend lived outside the Gila mill. Her father was a doctor. Her name was Vivka, a very beautiful girl. She was my age. When I grew up with Jews, we interacted. There was no confrontation, never. Neither her parents sent us away, nor ours. Never.
This is a complex of synagogues in the old market, at least 2 synagogues.
There used to be a sundial in this Synagogue Square. Now, one of the 3 Lithuanian synagogue complexes has survived here. To the left, there is a small winter synagogue. Now, on the multicultural center of Kadaini Regional Museum is located here, and the Kadaini Art School is located on the large summer synagogue on the right.
One of the most important Jewish religious centers should be the synagogue. The first synagogue was mentioned in the middle of the 17th century, and in 1784, when it was burned down, it was decided to construct a summer synagogue. This synagogue was built within few years, but its interior, decorating, and equipment took 21 years, because local Jews wanted to make it the most beautiful synagogue in Lithuania. So it was painted in a Babylonian style because Jews were deported to Babylon. There were luxurious, large lamps, and of course, the biggest decoration was a wooden Aaron Kadesh. In the summer synagogue, not all Jews would fit into it, and in 1837, a little winter synagogue was built next to the Great Synagogue. The winter synagogue was heated, and in order to avoid 2 synagogues being heated in winter, they only used one. The little winter synagogue was simple in form and undecorated. It was mostly used for the daily rituals. On the first floor of the gallery, where prayer meetings were held by women, there was the community council. There was even a Jewish court. In Slaughterhouse, there was a prison too for culpable Jews. A synagogue is not just the way we have a church only for praying. A synagogue had three functions: for prayer, as a school, and as a community meeting place. So by the end of the 19th century, when the number of Jews had already accounted for 60% of the population of the city, it was natural that there were more prayer houses and synagogues. It is believed that at the end of the 19th century, there were 8 or even 9 synagogues and houses of prayer. During the period between the First World War and the Second World War, large parts of the synagogues vanished because they were wooden and so they burned down. Now in Kadaini we have three stone synagogues, a complex of two synagogues, one of three in Lithuania, Joniškis Kalvarija in Kadaini, and a third synagogue called the Rich Merchants Synagogue, which is located on Smilga Street.
Sinagoga, kuri yra Smilgos gatvėje ir vadinama turtingųjų pirklių sinagoga.
There was a fire station behind the synagogues.
I guess because there were a lot of wooden houses in Kadaini, as in the whole of Lithuania in the interwar period.
Yes, you are right.
There were probably a lot which caught fire.
Yes, there was even a voluntarily team of Jewish firefighters, led by Uchikas Labinovich. Later, it was led by Tsadykas Šlapaberskis, a volunteer of the Lithuanian Armed Forces. There was even a separate fire orchestra.
Wow!
This team of volunteer Jewish firefighters played a very important part in the city's festivities, with that orchestra playing during the city festivals. It is mentioned that these firefighters were very active in the city's life. One of the last leaders of this firefighting team was C. Šlapaberskis. He was a former participant in the struggle for independence of Lithuania. He was awarded the Independence Volunteer Medal. His life ended very tragically because in 1941, after the Nazi occupation of Lithuania, the Holocaust began and all the Jews of Kadaini, including C. Šlapaberskis, were driven to a huge pit near the village of Daukšiai, where they were shot. C. Šlapaberskis, a former soldier, clearly did not want to give up so easily and resisted, taking a pistol from one of the shooters and shooting at but failing to hit a German officer. He then dragged the Lithuanian policeman into the pit and severely strangled him. It was inevitable that C. Šlapaberskis was going to be shot, but such an act of resistance in the grave pit was an exceptional case. This incident is described in many books and shows that some Jews were not resigned to be destroyed and tried to resist in at least some way.
So, do you remember Kadain Jews, and what do you remember about them?
I remember them very well, because I grew up with them. We ran, we talked. I remember their kindergarten was in the old town. The teacher was also a Jewish person. She always said, I will not forget those words in English. Ehad, shtaim, shalosh, arbach. A Jewish woman used to say, and the child walks nicely. Ehad, shtaim, shalosh, arbach. Even today, I remember those words.
And what did they mean?
It seems to me that they meant 1, 2, 3.
At 12 Smilga Street, it is believed that there was a Jewish primary school.
But as I understand, it did not survive. Is this a new building or is it rebuilt?
No, before it was built there was only an empty space. The school building did not remain.
At least the place is known.
It is not known when the first Jewish school was established in Kadaini, but it is believed that the 18th century of Yeshiva operated here a religious high school, and it operated here until the beginning of Holocaust.
How many schools were there in Kadaini in total?
During the interwar period, there worked only 2 Tarbal schools, 1 primary school and 1 middle school. It is believed that one of the primary schools was close to synagogues in the old square.
It is this one.
Yes.
In addition to public organizations, of which there were many in Kadaini during the interwar years, an orphanage for Jewish children was established. There were 7 orphanages for Jewish children in Lithuania back then. The orphanage in Kadaini was quite well equipped and it had huge rooms. In 19 30, about 23 children live there. This orphanage was sponsored by the Kadaini municipality, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and even Jews. Charity was provided, and children gave performances because they needed to show where the charity was spent. We are happy that this building has survived to the present day.
parodyti iš tiesų, kur keliauja ta labdara ir džiaugiamės, kad šitas pastatas išliko iki mūsų dienų.
After the First World War, all wooden quarters burned, and then, in accordance with the project of architect Ozenquist, streets were built here. That is how Kranto 1st Street and Kranto 2nd Street materialized.
It is the street.
Yes, and now we can see what authentic house facades look like. That is 2 windows, a door, and entrance from a street side.
Was it to make trading convenient?
Yes, now Lithuanians live here, but it's very good to see when the new hosts are conforming to history and not changing the appearance of the house.
Yes, Kadaini is like Rumšiškės, an open-air museum.
Yes, it survived. Actually, now it's called Milošo Street, because he was born not far from Kadaini.
Fantastic. Did Kranto 1st Street also survive? Wow, what famous people were born in Kadaini.
That's not all. One of the most famous rabbi, the writer and publicist M. Lilemblium, was born in Kadaini.
Oh, but it was not in the interwar period, or was it?
No.
I know about Lilenblium. He fought for equal rights of the Jews with other people and criticized child rearing and upbringing, as well as Jews' inability to adapt to a modernizing world. I really like that he fought the oppression of Jewish women by the Jewish community.
Against oppression.
Against, yes, against.
Among Jews, often a phrase was repeated that became classic. That is, 1 goat purchased in the Promised Land is more important than 10 gymnasiums.
Čia yra Nevėžio upė, kuri skiria ir Lietuvą, ir Kėdainius į 2 dalis.
Here's the Nevėžis River, which divides Kadaini and Lithuania into 2 parts. So on one side of me, on the left, there is Samogitia. On the right side, Aukštaitija. We are in the middle. So why was that? Because until about 18th century, the administrative border of Samogitia was the Nevėžis. And since Kadaini was developed on both sides of the Nevėžis, the river divided Kadaini and Lithuania into 2 parts. Next to the Nevėžis River, on a high hill, stands the oldest building in Kadaini, St. George Catholic Church, which was built in 1450-1460. This is actually quite early, considering that Samogitia was baptized only in 1414-1417, and after 30 years, a huge brick church with preserved Gothic elements appeared here. An interesting photo remains in the museum, the first president of Lithuania, A. Smetona, descending the stairs of this church in the interwar years. A. Smetona arrived in Kadaini to bury the remains of the deceased commander of the 2nd Artillery Regiment, J. Kibirkštis. And that event was extremely solemn, military marches and everything else in his honor. Our ancestors from Gedani remember this event.
Ir visa kita, tai tą įvykį iš tikrųjų prisimena net ir mūsų senoriai kėdainiškiai.
Atsimenu gerai Smetona patį, Antaną Smetoną gyvam.
I remember Smetona himself, in real life, in Kadaini. He arrived with Mrs. Smetonienė. I marched with them. There was Lithuania's military pipe orchestra playing too. I was around 9-10 years old at that time.
The Kadaini printing house operated in this building for a long time. It belonged to the Jews Movšovičius and Kaganas during the interwar period.
It is written here, 1923, a red brick masonry building, but here is a white building.
Yes, when the building was renovated during the Soviet era, it was painted white, losing the red masonry, typical of the style.
Yeah, it's written here too, but how unfortunate.
Yes, during the interwar period, an illustrated magazine, Muzikos Barai, was printed here, as well as Kėdainių Garsas and a children's magazine, Krekždutė.
And also, it is written that the garret was equipped with the living quarters and that the first floor was for printing with Tsarist machines and a German linotype.
Yes, and one book I read that those who worked at this printing house remembered that its owners were quite greedy and stingy, paying workers low wages.
It is believed that on this side of Nevėžis, a special synagogue stood called the Soldier Synagogue. It was built in the 19th century because at that time, during the reign of Tsarist Russia, Jews were drafted into the army, and when they returned, Orthodox Jews did not accept them to pray in a regular synagogue because they considered that they were no longer real Jews to perform religious rites, so they had to build a separate synagogue, a soldier synagogue. This synagogue unfortunately collapsed before World War II around 1938.
Šita sinagoga dėja sugriuvo iki Antrojo pasaulinio karo, maždaug manoma apie 1938 metus.
I remember this bridge all the time. It was already Smetona's time. I was already born here. It was a wooden, ordinary bridge. And during the war, probably in 1944, Russian tanks were moving. I saw myself. They were moving to the barracks where the Lithuanian army was. Then it was repaired for the second time when the Soviets come. It was repaired a little bit. And recently, it was rebuilt in a new way. We are now rich people from Kadaini. We have a beautiful bridge.
What an attractive bridge!
Reminds one of a crown, doesn't it?
Now as I look, maybe it's the Radziwill crown here.
Perhaps. In fact, it's a new Kadaini bridge. It has long been the main bridge and entrance to the city. It was bombed during the World War II, and when rebuilt, it was a pedestrian bridge. Here, a new bridge has now been built. It's a wooden, but painted in a color that looks like as if it was clad with iron. It was such a simple pedestrian bridge, and now it's still here.
Does this bridge have anything to do with Jews?
Yes, on the corner it was custom house where the first Jews custom officers who moved to Kadaini in the beginning of 17th century worked. Kadaini was one of the first cities in the territory of Lithuania to admit Jews to its multicultural community. Of course, it all happened thanks to the Radziwill.
Great Kadaini, a city of tolerance. Let's take a picture at the Crown Bridge.
Yes, of course.
The first bridge over Nevėžis was built in 1602. Naturally, it was necessary to collect taxes, so the Dukes of Radvila invited some Jews to Kadaini in 1624. To do this work well, King Radvila concluded an agreement with 3 Jews of Vilnius for them to administer Kadaini customs and collect taxes. Well, what were the fees for coming to Kadaini? Not only a monetary fee when driving across the bridge, but visitors had to bring 1 or 2 stones each during the market days, otherwise could not enter the city. Stones were collected in more than one place, not only here near the Nevėžis, but also in Josvainių and Šėtos streets, because the whole city had to be paved with stones so that they could be tidied up and made clean. What is interesting to mention is that such taxes were also imposed by the city of Riga and many Western European cities. Because the Radvila dukes had lived in Western Europe, they brought that good urban management experience to Kadaini. The Jews rented the customs authority and collected taxes. And what is more interesting is that in the second half of the 17th century, after the wars with the Swedes and the Russians, the city was indeed impoverished, and it is known that one Jew leased the whole city from the Radvils. Hence, the really rich and influential lived in Kadaini.
There was a bus station located here in Smetona's time. There was also another small annex with a cash register and a tea room. A Jewish bakery existed on the ground floor of our red house. The Jewish owner did the baking himself, but maybe there was some deputies. I don't really know. The bread rolls were very tasty, costing 3 cents per roll. My mother gave me 3 cents, so I bought a roll and then went to school on Vilnius Street. The school was wooden and painted yellow. It was demolished last year.
We are in Great Market Square. The present view of this market is familiar to many from those two charming houses, the facades of which are distinguished by the houses of other cities. This neighborhood is called the Scottish Quarter. Here, from the beginning of the 17th century, Scots began building brick houses. Of course, in the long run, wars, plagues, and all kinds of misfortunes changed the facades of those houses. If we look at M. Yoffe's photographs of Kadaini taken in the period of 1905-1907, then we will see a real picture of what Kadaini was like at that time. The square was a little smaller, encircled by some buildings, but those facades were genuine. M. Yoffe came to Gedani from Ukraine. Interestingly, in Germany he published a collection of postcards about Kadaini, and it is in that collection that there are many images of Kadaini before the First World War until 1914. Well, and these facades, these houses were severely destroyed during the First World War, and it is normal that people no longer had enough money to rebuild them. The current image of the one that is here now has only been like this since about 1980, 1985, when the house was rebuilt, and now it is like our business card.
It was as follows. Lithuanians lived in one house, Jews lived in the other two houses. They Jews traded inside. They would open the door right by the street and traded. The Jews were here all the time in Kadaini. I remember them as today, carried advertisements and gave even a rented bedding. Herring was sold in barrels. That barrel was like 80 kilograms. I remember my mom and I were going to buy herring. It's like this. If you paid 1 litas, you would get 11 herrings and 1 extra. It used to cost a liter, but 10 herring.
Kadaini has long been famous as a multicultural environment. Jews, Poles, Russians, Germans, and Scots have long lived here.
Scots? Did the Scots live in Kadaini?
Yes, there was a large community that has left Kadaini with a unique architecture.
Maybe it's those beautiful houses on postcards from Kadaini?
Yes, those are the ones. Jews also lived in them, only much later. And here we come to the Scottish Quarter. This is the Great Market, and there were markets here as well.
Gedani was located in the very geographical center of Lithuania, near the Nevėžis River, where the port was established. It is no coincidence that Kadaini developed as a city of merchants. Imagine, at the beginning of the 17th century, there were even 6 marketplaces in Kadaini. It is hard to even imagine. 4 were in this part of the city, that is the territory of Samagitia, and 2 on the other side of the Nevėžis, and they were all different. The older market, that is the former Jewish quarter, was used to trade firewood and fish. The Knipova Square, around which Russians were located, traded in goats. And the market in the German quarter was a horse market. We are now in the Great Market, a Scottish quarter, where small goods were traded, such as eggs and all kinds of household items. And there were 2 more marketplaces on the other side of the Nevėžis, in Aukštaitija.
And how long did the Scots live here?
The Scots lived in Kadaini for about 150 years.
Did they still meet the Jews or did they pass by?
Well, they sold their business to the Jews. You see, at the end of the 18th century, they realized that the Republic of Two Nations was beginning to collapse, and business conditions were poor, and counter-reformation had taken place. They just sold their business and set out to look for happiness elsewhere. Moreover, here on the right, these houses are the same homes of Scottish merchants.
One of the most beautiful surviving examples of architecture in Lithuania.
Yes.
But I would never have thought that it concerned Jews.
priemiesčio centre esanti didžioji rinka yra svarbi dviem aspektais. Tai yra tai, kad čia yra išlikusi.
The great market square that is in the middle of Kadaini Old Town is important in two aspects. One of the three town halls in Lithuania, which was built as a monument to the owners of the town, the Dukes of Valdas, back in 1653, has survived here. Without the Radvilos, we would not have such a city with its colorful history and buildings. Well, what is in that monument? This monument was created by the sculptor Valdas from Gedani, currently living in Klaipėda, and he depicts G. Radvila sitting on the treasury chest. In 1655, G. Radvila was the commander-in-chief of the Lithuanian armed forces. Then a terrible disaster struck Lithuania, and the Swedes invaded Lithuania from the west and the Russians from the east, meeting in Kadaini. The king of Poland and Lithuania, Kievaza, escaped from the state and left everyone to fend for themselves. Then Mr. Radvila, as the commander-in-chief of the army, made an attempt to save the state by consulting with the Swedes to form a Grand Duchy of Lithuania union with Sweden, thereby terminating the Lublin Union with Poland. This new union was signed in Kadaini at Radvilų Palace on October 20th, 1655. Well, the monument depicts that from Vilnius, which failed to defend against the Russians, the state treasury was brought to Kadaini, and here we have been joking for a while, at least in these circumstances, that we have been the capital of Lithuania. This contract was concluded. The Swedes undertook to fight the attacking Russians to stop their attack. However, it is known that this was indeed a difficult decision for Mr. Radvilas, as from Polish point of view, he became the greatest traitor because it dissolved their union with Lithuania. The Lublin Union had been signed back in the 16th century, and of course, immediately after, they began to call him a traitor Zdrajcka. They wanted to take away the manors after his death, but the Radvilas were not the kind of family to be pushed around and divested of their wealth. This monument also depicts the soldiers, both Lithuanian and Swedes, who signed this treaty. That treaty was short-lived, as both Russians and Swedes were expelled from Lithuania before it had come into full force, but it was simply an attempt to save Lithuania in the face of an emergency. Other historians assert that if Radvilas had not taken this action as a solution, then we would probably have been occupied by Russia as early as the 17th century instead of the end of the 18th century.
Ieškoti išeities, greičiausiai mes būtume buvę okupuoti Rusijos jau 17 amžiuje, o ne 18 amžiaus pabaigoje.
There is a photograph of what the Joy Street looked like in the end of the 19th century, until the beginning of 20th century. The Jewish taverns and buildings at the time can be seen in it.
And there in front this building, is it Scottish too? Because the architecture looks very similar.
Yes, in the 17th century this building belonged to the Scots, and in the 1990, when the decision was made to establish a Jewish People's Bank, the Jews themselves established it in here as in the wall of Lithuania. They were set up to train entrepreneurs.
Yes, we visited such in both Panevėžys and Šiauliai.
Yes. Branches were established in the Intuva Lithuania, and here it was the main Jewish People's Bank.
The Scots lived in Kadaini for more than 150 years, and they left a lot of brick buildings. One of them is behind my back, the house of J. Anderson, the mayor of Kadaini. Because the Scots who lived in Kadaini became like Lithuanians and became mayors and judges, preachers of the church, and even preachers of the Lithuanian language in the Evangelical Reformed Church. It is an interesting fact that J. Radvila also mentions a Scottish tobacco shop in his letter. It turns out that in 1653, when the Kadaini town hall was built, the Scots had already built a Schaffler house, where they founded the first tobacco shop, probably the most specialized in Lithuania, and J. Radvila was very angry about how the Scots built a house here, but they did not want to give money to a common wall with the town hall. Well, and I've also recently read about this, and it turns out that the Sumagitin bishop forbade Sumagitin nobles from buying Scottish tobacco from Kadaini. These are the peripetties among our Scots.
Raise your head. What do you see?
Star of David. Wow, it's still there?
Yes, Ratner's iron shop was in this house. Here next to it was Gurvich's apothecary. There's a photo that still exists taken in the interwar period, where that corner was captured. Gurvich's had written, oldest apothecary in Lithuania, but it wasn't true. It was maybe just the third oldest apothecary in Lithuania.
How many apothecaries were there in Kadaini?
3. 2 belonged to Jews, and 1 was owned by Lithuanian.
Pharmacy business for Jews in Tsarist Russia was allowed to operate only in the first half of the 19th century. The first Jewish pharmacist in Kadaini was mentioned in 1898. He worked as a chief for Joseph Girdzievska, to whom apothecary belonged. It was another unique event in Lithuania's history. A Lithuanian woman, a Catholic, was running this apothecary at the end of the 19th century. Of course, she could not do all the work alone. A man or men of some description had to help, so Chaim Frumkin was the chief of that apothecary. Maybe Joseph Girdzievska had worked for a long time and was no longer able to manage that apothecary, but in 1903 that apothecary was bought by Chaim Gurvichus, who owned it until the first Soviet occupation in 1940.
My mother, my mother's sister, and even my mother's mother work here for Jews, here in Kadaini. That's how it was, because there weren't many factories in Kadaini. My grandmother worked for Paishke, supervising and cleaning the Oshra cinema. She swept, prepared, opened the doors, and let out customers, and they went to watch films free of charge.
In addition to traditional Jew businesses, such as marketing, hairdressers, bakeries, and sewing shops, there was also a Jewish cinema theater, the Record, located at 28 Gedimino Street, now called Didžioji Street.
So here.
Yes, also there were mills, mechanical workshops, and there were also watchmakers, photographers, hotels.
Printers, customs officers, and cucumber businessmen.
Yes, and many other people doing business.
The first ever cinema theater in Kadaini opened in 1920, and it was created by the brothers Morkūnai after coming back from Ukraine and purchasing film equipment from the Germans. It was quite difficult to manage their cinema, so in 1923 they sold it to the Jew Eber Geriene. Thus, since 1923 until the Soviet era, the cinemas in Kadaini were owned by Jews. Eber Geriene named the cinema with a very Lithuanian name, Milda, and later on the brothers Kigeriai renamed it to Record. Young people went to the Kadaini cinema to watch movies and remember many evenings that were spent in there. For example, one memorable fact is that a court was held for the Lithuanian lady at the time, in which the famous woman of Kadaini spoke, some who cursed the emancipation of women, the others who defended. Thus, the cinema served not only like cinema, but also the needs of society, as there were not many other halls.
There was an entrance here, and a cash register. There was also a control point for checking the tickets. And there was the cashier. I remember well, 2 Lithuanian workers. Well, our grandmother was like that. She would let people exit after the cinema, then my grandmother would tidy up the hall and helped with house, keeping at Paishke.
Here at 22 Didžioji Street, then 47 Gedimino Street, was home to our Ronder's family of watchmakers. From the old surviving photograph, it can be seen that here, on the right, was the watchmaker's sign, and there, on the left, was the Didžioji Apteka of Polons.
Ah, that's one of the 3 pharmacies.
Yes, and now Victor lives in this building.
Which Victor?
A well-known man in Lithuania.
All the time the Polonez pharmacy was there. My aunt Urbanavichute worked here for many years. Downstairs the pharmacy, upstairs his, the pharmacist Polonus, living place. She helped with house, keeping in production of medicines, but not selling them. She worked there for many years. I'm a living witness here. I used to go there because she learned to bake very tasty bulkas. Halal.
Mes esame Smilgos gatvėje prie dar vienos išlikusios žydų sinagogos.
We are on Smilga Street next to another surviving Jewish synagogue which was built in the middle of the 19th century. It is thought that it was built with the help of Wilner, the richest tailor of Kadaini, because the rich merchants of Kadaini didn't want to pray with the poor and build a synagogue for the rich merchants. In this synagogue, there were very strictly separated parts for men and women. This synagogue functioned until World War II, when a bakery was established here during the Soviet era. Currently, the synagogue is being restored and adapted to the needs of Kadaini Art School. Because they no longer fit into one synagogue, more space is needed.
Todėl kad vienoje sinagogoje jie jau nebetelpa, reikia erdvesnių patalpų.
The plot on which this house stands dates back to the 17th and 19th centuries. A plot plan is typical of a old market environment.
What is it? What's so special about it?
Well, this property is a relic of a traditional Jewish lifestyle in Kadaini. The house consists of entrance hall for religious rituals, then the living quarters, and a vaulted basement beneath these. And another farming section has forge and a small barn.
Oh, we saw this kind of vaulted basement in Kupiškis, in the former house of the miller Schmidt.
Yes.
Is that something like this?
Actually, it is. Here's the most unique part of this small outbuilding. Here we go around a bit on the other side. You will see a rising skylight on the roof. You see?
Yes.
This cottage was designed to celebrate a tent festival. They opened that skylight, set up a table, and had a meal and then closed it again.
Then why they opened this skylight for?
This is a tradition. You see, every year in September for 1 week, Jews had to set up a tent with the walls, but with a hole in the roof. They remember their liberation from slavery in Egypt, when for 40 years they wandered in desert, living in tents and eating under the open sky.
That is so interesting. So that entrance hall was built so that they could open the skylight for 1 week in the year?
Yes, well, the Jews that lived here though, why bother to set up a tent when you can make the skylight in the entrance hall, open it, set up a table, eat, and close it again?
Genius. I know that every city has something to impress.
This type of house, designed to celebrate the Sukkot festival, might be the only one in Lithuania. After 1990, when we started to investigate the Jewish legacy, this was not the only instance of this type of skylight in Kadaini. But to be honest, back then didn't know what was their purpose, which is why these wooden houses were destroyed and there is no longer any sign of others. I'm very happy that one flax seller's house, which stood in the Great Market Square, was transported to the Rumšiškės Household Museum. It was rebuilt with the same skylight to celebrate Sukkot.
Į Rumšiškių buities muziejų atstatytas su tokiu pačiu stoglangiu Sukot šventei švęsti.
But how amazingly beautiful are Kadaini streets. How beautiful it is that they have kept this authenticity.
Yes, Žydų Street is very authentic and seemingly the shortest in Kadaini. While we were speaking, we almost bypassed the small shtetl because we were coming close to the Synagogue Square. And there they are.
And what was the Jewish people's destiny? Were they shot?
Yes, during the Holocaust.
This is the synagogue. In the old town, all of the market square was completely fenced off from the central street with wire. Where there was a gap, where there was a path to the street, everything was barricaded with barbed wire so that no one could slip out or enter. Germans oversaw this very strictly. The guards there walked around the synagogue. My mother, I remember, gave me food, and I used to bring it to the kids. I remember it well. A couple of times I needed to get through the wide fence, so a German would take me by the scruff and would mark me out.
More than 300 years of Jewish history in Kadaini ended during the World War II with the Holocaust. On August 28, 1941, near Kadaini, in the village of Lukshay, all the Jewish residents from the towns of Kadaini, Sheta, and Jimei were shot dead. This is to say, 2,076 people in one day. In fact, the Germans were very precise and counted them all. So from these 2,076, 710 were men, 767 were women, and even 599 were children. Thus, the city lost more than one-third of its residents, places were empty, and today monuments and memorial plaques recall their memory. Our multicultural center, which is located in the former Little Winter Synagogue, has a museum exposition where we have found in the archives of Israel the names more than 1,000 of Jews killed in Kadaini. They are all written out, divided into families, and you can see how many large families of 10 to 12 people were shot. The same installation has been created at the massacre site. There's also a board with all these surnames written on it because, according to Jewish traditions, mentioning a person's name is necessary, even after death.
Nes pagal judėjų tradicijas minėti žmogaus vardą yra būtina, kad ir po mirties.
Here we have circled around Kadaini and found ourselves at the same monument. This memorial next to that dedicated to remembering and honoring the Jews who were shot. It is the symbolism from the New Testament. An all-seeing third eye of God's providence, a burning bush and a pupil of the eye consisting cartridge cases. There are 2,076 of them, exactly the same number of Jews who were shot in the single day in Kadaini.
How scary. What about the stones? Because I remember that Jews bring neither flowers nor candles to the cemetery, but take a little stone from home.
Yes, the stones represent the eternity.